Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something that's been on a lot of people's minds, especially those who follow international relations very closely, and that is, could the war in Ukraine have been stopped earlier on?
Hmm.
We're going to be looking at the 2022 Istanbul Communiqué as a sort of a focal point for this discussion, because it's
Yeah.
really interesting. Just a month into the invasion,
Mhm.
we saw this moment where it seemed like peace might have been possible, at least on paper.
It really is fascinating how, the whole world was sort of reeling still from those initial images of the
Yeah.
conflict. And then suddenly both sides come to the table with some pretty significant concessions.
Yeah, so let's set the stage here a little bit for folks. So,
Mhm.
Russia's initial attempt to kind of shock and awe and take Kyiv very quickly, that failed.
Right.
And there was this sense that maybe dialogue could prevail. And so these talks happened in Istanbul and a communique was released. So what did this potential peace deal actually look like?
Well, on Ukraine's side, they were signaling a commitment to neutrality, so no joining NATO.
Right.
And they were open to a pretty lengthy negotiation process over Crimea,
Hmm.
which, is a huge step considering how important Crimea is to both sides.
Right. And so what was Russia offering at that point? They were the ones who started the conflict.
Yeah, well, interestingly enough, they said they wouldn't stand in the way of Ukraine joining the EU,
Hmm.
which is, you might be surprised to hear that considering how things are going now.
Right.
But even back then, it seemed like Putin was more concerned about NATO expansion than the EU.
Right.
And this kind of raises a question, was this really all about security concerns for Russia, or was there something else going on?
Yeah, so we have these concessions on the table. There's a potential pathway for Ukraine to join the EU.
Mhm.
It seemed like there was some genuine momentum, but obviously, as we all know, things didn't exactly work out that way. So what were the roadblocks that kind of derailed these talks
Well, one of the big sticking points was the size of Ukraine's military.
after the war?
Mm.
Ukraine wanted to maintain a force of 250,000 troops,
Mhm.
which they argued was necessary for self-defense.
Hmm.
But Russia insisted on a much smaller number, something like 85,000.
Wow.
And, you can really see the distrust there, right?
Oh, yeah.
Russia clearly felt threatened by a strong Ukrainian military,
Sure.
while Ukraine, felt like they needed that strength to protect themselves.
Right. That's a huge difference. So I can see why that would be a deal breaker
Yeah.
for both sides. Um, what else was going on? What were some of the other issues that were causing problems?
Well, the status of Crimea, obviously, that was a big one. The communique suggested a 15-year negotiation period
Okay.
to figure out the future of Crimea, but neither side was really happy with that.
Right.
Russia wanted immediate recognition of their annexation,
Of course.
and Ukraine wasn't about to just give up their claim to the territory.
Yeah. So, kind of classic agree to disagree, but the stakes are incredibly high.
Right. Were there any other factors that sort of contributed to this breaking down?
Well, there were reports, and I emphasize reports, that Russia was demanding Zelensky's resignation as part of the deal.
Oh, wow.
That they basically wanted to put a pro-Russian leader in his place. Now, if that's true, that suggests that regime change was part of the plan all along,
Yeah.
not just taking territory.
That's a huge revelation because it reframes everything you know.
Yeah.
It really makes you question whether Russia was ever actually committed to this peace process.
Exactly. And I think to understand the complexity of the situation, you really have to look at what happened after the Istanbul talks.
Yeah.
Because that's when things on the ground started to shift dramatically, which really muddies the waters when it comes to the question of could there ever have been a peace deal? But, even before we get into all that, I think it's worth asking the question, was a deal ever really possible, even with all these roadblocks in place?
Right.
That's something we'll have to explore further when we come back.
This has been a fascinating look already at this Istanbul Communique and the potential for an early end to the war. If you want to learn more about this, the source that we're using for this deep dive is the 2022 Istanbul Communiqué, Ukraine, Russia, and the Collapsed Peace Talks, which was published in our Asian Times. We're going to keep exploring this after a quick break, but first we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on these early peace negotiations? Anything stand out to you? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives. We'll be right back.
So, before the break, we were talking about those roadblocks to peace that came up during the Istanbul talks.
Right.
But even as those talks were happening, things on the ground were changing. you know?
Yeah.
And that ended up having a huge impact on how the whole conflict played out.
Yeah, it's like we had these two parallel realities.
Exactly.
At the negotiating table, you have people offering concessions and trying to find common ground.
Hmm.
But then on the battlefields, the war is still raging.
Right.
So what were some of the key developments, I guess, that kind of changed the course of the conflict?
Well, for one, Ukraine started to have some unexpected military successes.
Okay.
They managed to push back Russian forces in places like Kharkiv and Kherson,
Huh.
which really nobody expected.
Yeah.
And it showed that they were more resilient than people thought.
Yeah. I mean, those victories must have been really significant.
Oh, absolutely.
Not just strategically, but psychologically.
For sure.
It's one thing to negotiate when you're losing, but when you start winning,
Right.
it gives you a whole different perspective.
Totally. It really boosted morale in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And it also got more countries on their side,
Mhm.
willing to send them weapons and support.
Yeah, so the tide was turning both on the battlefield and diplomatically.
Right.
But then, of course, there's that one event that really shocked the world and made it pretty much impossible for anyone to support Russia anymore.
Yeah.
The atrocities in Bucha.
The Bucha massacre was definitely a turning point. I mean, those images that came out of there, the executions, the torture, the violence against civilians, it was just horrific.
It really was.
And it hardened Ukraine's resolve.
Right.
I mean, how could they even think about compromising with Russia after that?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to imagine,
Yeah.
after seeing something like that, how you could even sit down at the negotiating table.
Right.
This doesn't seem right.
Bucha really destroyed any trust that might have been left between the two sides.
Yeah, so you have these military victories that are making Ukraine more confident.
Right.
You have Bucha, which turns the world against Russia.
Yeah.
And suddenly the door for negotiations slams shut.
Mm-hmm.
So was this really a missed opportunity for peace? Or was a real deal never even possible in the first place?
Well, even Putin himself later denied that there was any agreement in Istanbul.
Really?
He said they were just preliminary, not a concrete deal.
That sounds a little suspicious.
Yeah.
Like he's trying to rewrite history. Yeah, it does a bit, doesn't it?
What did Zelensky have to say about that?
Well, Zelensky always maintained that Russia's demands weren't really negotiable.
Okay.
He said it was more like an ultimatum than a good faith effort to find some middle ground.
Yeah, so basically, here are our demands, take it or leave it.
Exactly.
Not exactly a recipe for trust and lasting peace.
No, not at all. And to make things even more complicated, you have some analysts who say that the whole idea of a deal being close was a misperception.
Okay.
There's this Polish analyst, Daniel Zilgowski,
Okay.
who said that the idea of both sides being on the verge of an agreement is simply false.
So we have Putin backtracking.
Yeah.
We have Zelensky saying it was an ultimatum.
Mm-hmm.
And we have analysts like Zilgowski saying a deal was never really on the table.
Right.
It's hard to know what to believe.
It really is. And it makes you question whether Russia was ever really serious about finding a peaceful solution. Yeah. I mean, what was Putin thinking? Was he genuinely trying to find a way out of this, or was it all just a ploy to buy time?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
And we might never know the answer for sure. But by looking closely at the evidence, at what each side was willing to offer, and at how the situation was changing on the ground, we can start to get a better understanding of this really crucial moment in history.
So welcome back to our deep dives into the Istanbul Communiqué and that missed opportunity for peace in Ukraine. We've really gone through it.
Yeah.
We've looked at what was being proposed, what each side was willing to give up,
Yeah.
and all those things that ultimately made the talks fall apart.
It's been a fascinating discussion. And honestly, it's kind of a sad story, too.
Yeah.
We saw how that hope for a negotiated settlement,
Yeah.
it just vanished because of mistrust and because the two sides wanted different things and because the situation kept changing on the ground.
And as we're thinking about all of this, I mean, the one big question that comes to mind is, what can we actually learn from this? What lessons can we take away from the failure of these talks? That might help us understand how to resolve conflicts and do diplomacy better in the future.
Well, I think one thing that really stands out is the importance of timing.
Okay.
The Istanbul talks happened at a very specific moment.
Yeah.
After Russia's first attack had failed. But before Ukraine really started winning battles, maybe things would have been different if they'd talked later on when the balance of power had shifted,
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it suggests that even when a war is going on, there might be moments where dialogue and diplomacy could work.
Right.
But those moments, they don't last forever. you know?
Exactly. They can be
We,
really fleeting.
they depend on so many different things.
Another really important lesson is about trust, or I guess the lack of it.
Mhm.
And in this case, there was so much suspicion between Russia and
All right.
Ukraine, all those historical grievances and those competing narratives.
All right.
It made it almost impossible for them to really compromise.
It's not enough just to have an agreement on paper. You
Exactly.
need to have a foundation of trust.
Yeah.
You need to understand each other
Right.
and try to address the root causes of the conflict if you want peace to actually last.
Absolutely. And I think the Istanbul experience also shows how important the international community is in these kinds of situations.
Yeah.
The talks themselves were between Russia and Ukraine,
Right.
but the bigger picture, all that support Ukraine was getting from the West
Hmm.
and all the condemnation Russia was facing, that play a huge role in how the negotiations went.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is,
For sure.
and how important it is for countries to work together to resolve these kinds of conflicts and uphold international norms.
It's a shame that the Istanbul talks failed.
Yeah.
It was a real loss for everyone involved.
Yeah.
But, if we study this case carefully,
Right.
if we understand why it fell apart,
Yeah.
maybe we can avoid making the same mistakes in the future.
It's a sobering thought,
It is.
but it's so important for us to keep engaging with these really tough issues.
Absolutely.
We need to learn from the past and apply those lessons to what's happening right now and try to create a future where dialogue and diplomacy and peaceful solutions are the norm.
Couldn't agree more. And as we wrap up our deep dive into the Istanbul Communiqué,
Mm-hmm.
I really encourage everyone listening to learn more about this topic.
Yeah.
The source we use for this episode, the 2022 Istanbul Communiqué, Ukraine, Russia, and the collapsed peace talks from our Asian Times, it offers a really thorough and insightful look at this crucial moment.
It's definitely worth reading if you want to understand more about the complexities of the war in Ukraine and the challenges of making peace in our world.
Yeah.
And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So please share your insights, questions in the comments.
Yeah.
Your engagement really helps to enrich this conversation and keep it going.
Definitely. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the world's most pressing issues.
We'll see you next time.